Hello, everybody. I'm Richard Griffiths, and welcome back to the final session of the 31st Bar Media and Judiciary Conference, presented with the organizational support of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. Thank you to our sponsors whose contributions go so far to support this conference. The names are on the screen, especially like to thank the State Bar of Georgia, CNN, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Daily Report, the Council of Superior Court Judges, the other judges' councils, and of course the Administrative Office of the Courts, and the many law firms that contributed to make this conference go so smoothly. One last reminder to the judges and lawyers wanting CLE for this conference: please make sure your screen name matches the name with which you signed up, so your attendance can be noted. If you have questions for this panel, post them into the chat. The moderators will work them in as time permits. We'll also be posting a link to the bios and the agenda in the chat. Since this is the last part of the program, we want to let you know that registered participants will be receiving a questionnaire in the near future, seeking feedback on the sessions. I know you get a lot of surveys. Whether you think we've done things well or that we completely blew it, please answer the question so we can make our offering stronger. So now our final session, Election Central Season 2, covering Georgia politics and election in 2022. That session put together by the terrific team of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's managing editor, Sean McIntosh, and the AJC's Patricia Murphy, who's moderating today. Patricia, take it away.
Well, hello. Thank you so much, Richard, for including us. Thank you for including the AJC. My father and my husband are both members of the Georgia Bar, so it's an honor to be a part of anything CLE related, because I know that that's a high bar to achieve. So thank you really for including us. So our panel today is definitely going to cover our work covering politics in 2022. Of course, though, we know that these political campaigns and elections don't happen in a vacuum. Right now, we are in a legislative session as well, and that really has a lot to do with the political themes that we're going to be seeing on the campaign trail as well. So we have a lot to cover. We have three terrific reporters joining me on the panel as well, and we're going to go through all of these themes. And I hope it's something that all of you can use in your own work. And then also all of us are sort of armchair political analysts as well. So I hope that will strengthen your work in that area as well. First, I'm going to introduce Rahul Bali. Rahul is a politics reporter for WABE here in Atlanta. He also appears weekly on the Gold Dome Scramble podcast. Rahul has worked as a reporter, producer, and editor for CNN Radio, Oconee Radio Group, east of Atlanta, WSB Radio Group, and WTOP Radio here. I'm sorry, that's in Washington, D.C. Rahul, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be on, everybody.
We're also joined by Stephen Fowler. Stephen is an award-winning reporter for GPB News, covering state and local politics. He's also the host of Battleground Ballot Box. It's a terrific podcast where you can follow Stephen's work, and he's done some of the deepest reporting on campaigns, elections, and really the apparatus of elections here in Georgia. So if that's an area of your interest, you will certainly want to hear his podcast. It's a great area of learning for me as well. Stephen's work focuses on voting rights and election law, state government, and campaigns. You can also hear him, I believe, from time to time on NPR. I know I've heard him on NPR as well, if you're listening to the national shows in the morning or the afternoon. So Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And our third reporter joining us today, and I hope his audio has been worked out. If it has not, I'm still going to introduce him because I know he's going to join us at some point. And it's Chuck Williams. Chuck is a reporter, an award-winning reporter for WRBL TV News 3 in Columbus, Georgia. Chuck joined the station after more than 35 years as a print reporter and editor. He had more than 3 decades with the Columbus Ledger-Enquirer as well before his TV transition. And when he's been covering Columbus, really from top to bottom, he's covered extensively courts, crime, politics, military, because of course, Fort Benning is in Columbus. He's also covered business and local government issues in Columbus and the Chattahoochee Valley. So if you're with us, I'm not sure if you are.
Yeah,
but if you're with
I
us.
am here,
good.
Patricia, and I think
Okay.
we're good.
Okay, great. Well, great. We have a full house. So thank y'all so much for joining us today. I'm going to kick it off with a quick chat about the 2022 legislative session that Rahul, I know you've been covering this. You're down there every single day covering the House and Senate. And when you and I were chatting about this, you said that there are a number of bills that you're watching. Tell me about what is active right now that you're watching that really has quite a bit to do with the legal community.
So first, thanks. I'm honored to appear. Thanks for the invitation. We haven't done a ton of legal stories up to this point. I think the biggest one we did was the State of the Judiciary address by now then, and it still is, the Supreme Court Chief Justice David Namias, and just discussing the fallout from COVID and the backlog in cases, along with the increased number of cases because of crime. But that's really all we've done. But pretty good timing for this conference. We've got a couple of bills that are going to be coming up here in the next week or two. One of those deals with e-notary. That was one of the big discussion points coming out of COVID. Who does that? What's the security behind it? Non-Georgia companies can do that. So what happened yesterday was a conference committee was appointed on House Bill 334. And a conference committee is usually the last step before a deal is worked out on a bill. So we could see some progress on when it comes to e-notaries. A bigger bill that deals with the appeals process within the state of Georgia, and specifically cases coming out of probate and magistrate. There's also legislation on that, House Bill 916, that actually also cleared committee yesterday. And I kind of, reading into it, the big concern there is you're seeing the possibility, or what's happened, where cases, when they're being appealed to state and superior court, being dismissed not on merit, but being dismissed because of procedural grounds or issues of case moving from one place to another. That's trying to streamline and clean that up. That bill cleared committee. We could see a vote on that coming up the next week. And then the last thing, again, was speaking to different lawmakers, just asking them, hey, what should I be watching for? The idea of apportionment in civil lawsuits, when someone is sued, something happens, a robbery or something happens on business grounds, you're suing the owners, the business, and then the person who robs you. Who's responsible? What's that percentage? That's House Bill 961. It is right now on the House floor awaiting action. Really interesting bill because it only changes 4 words, but it changes who's responsible. Who pays, who's liable when someone has a civil lawsuit. So those are just some of the bills that are going to be moving possibly this coming week.
All right. I know something else that you're watching down there is really sort of a theme of civil action becoming a prominent court recourse for Georgians. What are you seeing down there at the legislature that's bringing that to your attention?
I'll give you an example. For those of you who were watching the news yesterday or follow the Capitol, there was a bill that was dealing with transgendered girls playing in girls' sports in school. So, but at the end of that bill, it says the aggrieved parties, and I believe it says something we didn't cover much, who sues? It gives, my understanding, a civil right to action. And so it's interesting, and you see that in some other bills too, this idea of instead of the state stepping in and suing or punishing, there's going to be legal action taken. And so that's going to be interesting for lawyers, whether they're the lawyers who are suing or they're defending an organization through civil action. Okay. And we've seen that on a couple of bills.
Okay. I can think of even a couple of other bills where we've seen that. I want to also say to the audience, if y'all are hearing anything that you want to ask a follow-up question on, please drop that in the chat and we will save some time at the end to come back and get into more detail if any of these that we hit quickly are something that you want to hear a little bit more about. One
Or
bill
you
that I
can
know,
correct me too.
yeah, oh, yes, correct us,
correct me.
please.
I play
We
a
like
lawyer
that
on the
too.
radio.
Okay. One bill that I've been watching is a bill from Senator John Albers, and it's been informed quite a bit by DAs around the state. Fonnie Willis, the DA in Fulton County, has informed that as well. That's a bill to give more resources to the GBI crime lab. We hear quite a bit from prosecutors who feel like they don't have the support they need to really process their evidence quickly, to process the ballistics, the rape kits. This bill will give more resources to that. It also will, she's hoping, and I know Senator Albers is hoping to strengthen some of the actual man strength in the DA's offices. Also give some stronger penalties, some tougher penalties to gun crimes. That's a bill from Senator John Albers, just to keep an eye on if any of that is in anybody's practice area. Something that I think is certainly going to be a big theme in the election coming up on these statewide races is crime. I know that bill is answering that theme. It's a bill that Governor Brian Kemp has also put his weight behind. And we hear a lot about crime as an issue in Atlanta. The Buckhead City debate was really driven by the issue of crime, but it's not just an Atlanta issue. And Chuck, I know that in Columbus, this has really spiked as an issue in people's individual lives and also politically. So tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in Columbus.
I started my day this morning on a murder scene in North Columbus, shooting video and stuff. We've had 7 homicides this year. We had 63 here last year. We have between 110 and 120 defendants sitting in the Muskogee County Jail awaiting trial for murder. That backlog that Rahul was just talking about, that is a very, very real thing. And this throughout the state, Columbus is no different. But we have a mayor's race this year, and we have a one-term mayor who is seeking re-election, and he is now being challenged. And essentially the billboard from the guy that one of the people that will challenge him is, why are we 130 officers short? Why are Columbus officers leaving for Gwinnett? Stuff, those types of messages, that's crime. Our police force is 130 officers of a 500 officer force down right now. That's significant. And, is that the reason for the crime? Probably not. But Columbus appears to be losing more officers than it's hiring right now in the whole deal. So it's going to be an incredibly important issue as we have a businessman with no political experience at all stepping in to challenge a mayor who spent 20 years on council before his first term as mayor. It's going to be incredibly interesting down here to watch how crime, COVID, everything else, but you throw crime into the mix, and this isn't the Buckhead City debate, but it's our version of crime matters. It impacts a lot of people. I'm not just talking about the murders. I'm talking about car break-ins, car thefts, other stuff. And we're a town of roughly 200,000 people. And, most people I know somebody who's been the victim of some kind of crime or has been impacted by this. So it's going to be it's something to watch, because politics and crime, particularly in municipal elections in places like Columbus, are going to intersect in a big way in 2022.
Yeah, we certainly saw that in the most recent mayor's race in Atlanta. There is another race coming up in Augusta for their mayor's race as well. Chuck, also a number of DAs were recently elected in 2020, but I believe that a Columbus DA was unlike any others. Tell us a little bit about what happened after that DA was elected.
Our former DA is in prison right now. That's
Yes.
all you need to know. He served 10, he was convicted 11 months after he took office of public corruption. He he was accused of asking a police officer to lie under oath so he could upgrade a involuntary. It was a manslaughter charge, and I can't remember if it's voluntary or involuntary. I don't want him to screw that up, but a manslaughter charge to a murder charge. He had a 10-minute conversation with a police officer on the street at midnight coming out of a bar. It was profanity laced. It was as unprofessional as anything any lawyer has ever seen. And that video was part of the evidence. He was asking the officer to lie under oath to upgrade the charge. That was one of the charges against him. His name's Mark Jones. Mark is still in prison now. He was taken into custody in mid-November and taken straight into the state system. And it has thrown an incredible monkey wrench in an already screwed up situation. COVID, we've had courthouse issues with the availability of courtrooms because of flooding and stuff. And then you throw a DA who literally came into office and was never effective and was gone within 11 months of being elected. He was, quote unquote, his campaign slogan was the people's DA. That's how he ran. And, you know, and the city prosecuted him for what essentially was a trumped up charge early on about doing donuts in a civic center parking lot. But there was far more serious stuff. And when that stuff finally came out, it didn't take long for him to be convicted. And he asked for a speedy trial, and he got it.
Yes, he sure did. So another DA that was elected in 2020 is Fulton County's Fani Willis. Stephen, I know you're covering carefully and watching carefully a case that she's been covering, and we're kind of going to go down from the more granular cases to, this is a big one. This is maybe one of the most closely watched court cases in the country. Tell us a little bit about Fani Willis's investigation into former President Donald Trump.
Right. So Fani Willis has the unenviable task of figuring out what, if any, crimes one of the most powerful people in American politics might have committed in one of the most closely watched elections and one of the most tightly contested elections that we've had probably in recent history, at least. There's a lot of moving parts and pieces to this because there's a lot of moving parts and pieces to what went on in the lead up to November 2020 and the months afterwards. You've got the infamous call between former President Trump and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, where he asked him to, quote, find votes. You've got calls that Trump made to the top investigator in the Secretary of State's office, asking about the different counting process and if there was anything to be found. You've got calls that South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham made to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger about absentee ballots. You've got some kangaroo court legislative hearings that took place in November and December where lawmakers had a bunch of people come in and make false claims to lawmakers, like Rudy Giuliani, the president's attorney. Throughout all of this, you have the backdrop of failed lawsuit after failed lawsuit after failed lawsuit trying to challenge different aspects of the November presidential election and change rules for the January 2021 election. And, it's an unenviable task for a lot of reasons. I mean, politically, the former president has a lot of, and contends that he has a lot of legal immunity for things that he might have said and done, and he still feels like he's done nothing wrong. And also, it's just such a tangled web that what you don't see in my background is the giant yarn string, chalkboard, whatever that I have to use to keep track of all of the different developments with the 2020 election and the legal impacts of it that we now have in Fani Willis's court with this special grand jury that she's got.
What kind of a timeline do you think people can expect coming out of that? Do you have any idea?
I mean, it's not going to be anything quick because there's just too many things to look at. There's too many things to consider. there's too many different charges to weigh, and there's too much pressure. It's not like something you can get in a 15-minute huddle with a jury and say, yeah, we think this happened. Here's your charges. Have a nice day. The DA's office has somewhat frustratingly been tight-lipped about a lot of their plans. They're not leaking a lot of things. They're not broadcasting and telegraphing what they're doing. But I would think that, as these months continue, the special grand jury hasn't even been impaneled yet. I believe it's May. But it's not something that we're going to see resolved quickly, and will hang over in some way the 2022 election and heading into the 2024 presidential election as well.
And
Okay,
that's
well,
something I'm definitely going to be watching,
Yep.
is that hangover, because you impanel the jury in May, and maybe you start seeing subpoenas either immediately or as even we get closer to the election. I think Stephen's right. You're not going to have charges, but you depose the former president, that's going to be definitely talked about during an election. It's something that's, I think, somehow going to fit in this whole picture that is going to be the May primaries and then the November elections.
And,
Yes.
and there's also, and there's also just so many witnesses and players, and there's a lot that's been reported already and been put out in public already. But you have a lot of people, both with the Fulton County investigation, but also the larger federal January 6th investigation, that are kind of publicly dragging their feet and say, you want information, you're going to have to subpoena me to get it. And that's going to take up time as well.
And you haven't even talked about the Republican slate of electors that could possibly be a part of an investigation as well.
Right. I think actually today, Republican Party Chairman David Schaefer met with the January 6th committee after they asked him for more information about Georgia's alternative slate.
And at this very moment, I'm watching video that looks like shot about a little over an hour ago of him walking out of that interview. So it's CNN video. So it's going to be interesting to see if anything information wise comes out of that, before the actual report.
Well, I think this whole conversation is such a great demonstration of what all of us have lived over the last 2 years. Is that it just feels like it has been one continuous event. It felt like it was the 2020 elections into the 2021 runoffs, straight into the legislative session, straight into who's going to be running in 2022. Now we're right back here at the legislative session. We're going to roll right into the primaries. And it just is never stopped. Donald Trump is obviously a huge player throughout that entire conversation. And so let's get a little bit into the political dynamics here that we're looking at. All of us are covering these campaigns kind of from our own perspectives and our own beats. And so Rahul, let's start with you. What are the 2 or 3 key races that you are really thinking you're going to be spending your time on over the next couple of months?
Obviously, the governor's race. You have 3, major candidates in that race. Obviously David Perdue challenging the sitting governor, and then Stacey Abrams waiting for whoever comes out of that. Also, I think another race is following is Secretary of State. The elected person who oversees Georgia's elections. It's not a race that's been high profile. I'm part of the Atlanta Press Club debate committee, and the Secretary of State's race has always been kind of a second tier race. I can tell you this time around, both the primaries and the elections will not be second tier for the Secretary of State. That Secretary of State race is going to be, not quite on the level of Senate and governor, but it will be right there as a race to watch. I know Stephen obviously is watching that. I am going to try to make sure I take time to watch, smaller races, state house races. There are quite a few interesting state house races, both on the Republican side and on the Democrat side, that I'm going to be watching as well. And I do also want to hear the Attorney General's race. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting questions to ask, to ask candidates who are running, because we could have a state where, Republicans are partially in charge and Democrats are partially in charge. So if you are a Democratic Attorney General, are you going to be defending all the laws that are passed by maybe a Republican governor? and a Republican legislature. That's going to be a question that's going to be asked to a Democratic candidate. So those are three races right there. Those three plus some smaller races that I want to see what's happening on the ground around the state.
Yeah, I feel like we're definitely going into a cycle where for the first time we could really see the reality of divided government with a governor of one party, lieutenant governor of another, attorney general of another. What is that? What cases do the state bring if the AG and the governor are not in the same party? Right now, there's so much coordination between those two offices. It would be kind of crazy to see what happens if that's not the case. And something that I like to tell groups frequently is to sort of think globally, but vote locally. Those local races, those state house and state senate races are so crucial. And also, of course, the individual congressional races. And Chuck, I'm going to bring you in here because I think it feels like the second congressional district race has gotten a lot of attention recently. And that's the first time that that's really happened. So talk about that race and then tell us what else you're seeing from Columbus. It's a crucially important part of the state for our statewide races as well.
When you look at the second congressional district, we're talking about the seat held by Sanford Bishop, who has quite a number of years. Was it 26, I believe, in Congress? And Sanford's seat has changed over his tenure. 10, 12 years ago, when Mike Cowan, the minister out of Thomasville, I believe, or down in South Georgia, challenged him and came close. Sanford's seat was redrawn and was redrawn in 2010, became far more Democratic. Some districts around it became far more Republican, but he has been in a pretty safe seat for 10 years. Well, it's been redrawn again, and it's a little more closer to the middle. Not exactly there, but close enough. And it has essentially South Columbus, which is Democratic, West Macon, Democratic, Albany, Democratic. Those are three strongholds in that seat. And, we'll be watching that. I'm not sure that is a toss-up seat yet, but it's certainly one to watch. The seat we'll be watching, and I know Rahul will attest to this too, is House District 135. That seat is held by Calvin Smyrie. It has not been an open seat in almost 50 years. Calvin is the dean of the General Assembly. He has been challenged one time in that cycle, and he won, and that was 2008 during the President Obama's first victory. And but Calvin is about to become the ambassador to the Dominican Republic when confirmed, and it's sparking a lot of interest down here. That seat's never been attainable for anyone. I mean, you could not beat Calvin Smyrie, and Calvin has turned into, and I'd love to hear Rahul's thoughts on this. Calvin has turned into a really interesting diplomat who, though Democratic, a longtime Democrat, a Blue Dog Democrat, he has been able to work with Governor Kemp and Republicans in a way that few Democrats in Georgia have been. And that's the race I'm very interested in, House Seat 135.
And replacing, I actually had a conversation on the House floor with him this past week, and the conversation, and the reason we were having the conversation was we've had a couple of big names here at and I'm not at the state capitol right now, but a couple of big names at the state capitol who announced they're leaving. Terry England, who's the more than a decade chairman of the Budget Committee. Lindsey Tippins, a state senator who has been a longtime voice on education. And so the conversation that then Dean Smyrie, and that's how we refer to him because he's the longest serving member of the legislature, is institutional knowledge leaving the building. With him and Terry England and Lindsey Tippins, that right there, right off the top of my head, is easily 100 years of experience. There's a lot with what's going on right now. There's a lot of institutional knowledge that is leaving the state capitol, and that's my observation. Again, think about it. That man was first elected before I was born. There are very few people left in the legislature who've been there since before, but he got there in 1975. I'm trying to go off the top
He
of my
was
head.
elected in 74, got there in
For-
75.
Which the man has seen is so much when you think
You-
about it. It's unbelievable to think about what that man has seen, including, think about that. He was there when Jimmy Carter became president of the United States. So
You know what's interesting, and when I call him Calvin, it's not out of disrespect. It's out of respect because I've been dealing with him through my 25 years, and and Dean's. I mean, you're calling him Dean Smyrie, and that's what I should be calling him. But just know that when I say Calvin, it is absolutely it's with total respect.
Now, Stephen, I think you were down in Chuck's neighborhood recently covering the governor's race. Tell us a little bit about the trip that you went on with Governor Kemp. I think you've been following him around the state a little bit.
So I've been a lot of places in the state lately because we are the only true statewide media outlet that covers the entire state. And so I try to match that. I was in Southwest Georgia recently. Actually, it was on a Senate campaign covering Kelvin King hitting all 159 counties in 30 days. But in the past couple of weeks, I've spent time with David Perdue and with Brian Kemp on the campaign trail. And, the governor's race is interesting. There was actually a Boston Globe reporter that joined me for some of the stops because she was working on a story about the concept of Donald Trump's endorsement not carrying as much weight as it used to. Because you have some examples like Brian Kemp, where on paper there shouldn't be a reason there should be a primary challenge. I mean, Brian Kemp has delivered a lot of victories for conservative voters in Georgia, whether it's the abortion law challenged in court, the election law that's being challenged in court, the smaller state government leading through the COVID pandemic. In theory, he shouldn't really face a serious primary challenge. And that's kind of what it's bearing out so far. Even though Donald Trump has endorsed David Perdue, it's not quite the serious, formidable primary challenge that some people were hoping. Brian Kemp is still a very popular governor. He's very popular in rural parts of the state. He spends a lot of time in rural parts of the state. A lot of his economic development forces that he's put together have focused on rural parts of the state. And that's something that, in talking to voters, is something that people remember and people pay attention to more so than any one politician's endorsement. So the governor's race is something interesting to watch. The Secretary of State's race, obviously, is one of my main interests in, how can Brad Raffensperger, who one poll said he had a higher favorability rating with Democrats than he did with Republicans, can he survive a primary challenge? And if so, can he win in the general election? Potentially, because he has the crossover appeal of standing up to President Trump for the election results and standing by things. But that was going to be an interesting race because we've seen so many election law changes come even before COVID and even before 2020. I mean, in 2019, there was another massive election law that was passed that changed a bunch of things, that authorized new voting equipment. And I think people forget about that. Nobody was paying attention to that sweeping election law as much. But really, over the last 4 years, we've seen voting laws and the voting process fundamentally transformed in just about every step of the process. So ideas about that and how that trickles down to who people vote for Secretary of State is going to be something to watch. But I mean, not just because I'm speaking to a bunch of lawyers and judges, but the Attorney General's race is something that is worth watching because you've got Trump on the Republican side and anti-Trump on the Democratic side with a lot of things. But really the Attorney General's race right now, which looks like it'll be State Senator Jen Jordan against incumbent AG Chris Carr, looks like it will be one of the few races where policy actually gets to trickle down a little bit more than whatever's happening with Trump or partisan feelings, and that you've got two really strong candidates that have a lot of legal background and a lot of policy background and positions and stances that they can really use to flesh out their campaigns and speak to voters. Like you mentioned, Attorney General Carr and Governor Kemp have worked hand in hand on a lot of different things, whether it's, crackdowns on gangs and human trafficking and things to joining lawsuits challenging Biden administration decisions and things. And so he's got a healthy body of work as the AG to say, this is why I should continue to be your top legal mind. And Jen Jordan has been a rising star in the Democratic Party, and her floor speeches opposing different legislation and supporting different legislation, gives her something more than just a campaign slogan to run off of. So, I mean, I'm really fascinated by the Attorney General's race, but also, some of the congressional races as well. I mean, I don't think Sanford Bishop's race is a toss-up race. I think the strategy of putting him on a vulnerable list signals more about Democrats messaging in Georgia in a terrible national environment for them than a sign that Sanford is going to be beaten handily by some Republican in a red wave. In talking with Democrats and with Stacey Abrams when she declared, there's a lot more focus on the type of campaign messaging and the type of vibe that they used in places like Southwest Georgia to help elect Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff in the runoffs, that shies away from a lot of the more progressive things or outwardly progressive things and focuses more on a message of rural Georgia is important. It hasn't been served enough. We believe we can do it. And oh, by the way, we happen to be Democrats. That's a lot more tolerable. Think about Raphael Warnock and the puppy, for example. But, I think the second district is worth watching to see, because it's going to be kind of the leading edge of how Democrats run in Georgia, where everywhere else is going to be a disaster for them, most likely.
Yeah, I think that also is the only true toss-up race among the congressional races in the state. Everything else is pretty well.
With the way things
Yeah.
have been redrawn, the 6th and the 7th and the 10th all have primary elections that will basically be the de facto general election, and everything else is so solidly entrenched. I mean, people can try to say that Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to be unseated in Northwest Georgia, but they probably have something they want to sell you or raise money for.
Yes, they're raising a lot of money up there. Before we move on from what you were talking about, go back really quickly to the Secretary of State's race and unpack that a little bit. The other candidates running against Raffensperger and also on the Democratic side, just so they know a little bit more about the challenge that he's getting. And I think Jody Hice looks like he's obviously the big fish in that primary against him.
Yeah, so, Jody Hice is the Trump endorsed candidate. He's the current congressman, doesn't really have much experience in elections, doesn't really have a campaign message beyond Brad Raffensperger messed up 2020 and we're going to fix it. You've also got David Belle Isle, the former mayor of Alpharetta, who was the runner-up in the Republican primary in 2018, who's done a lot more campaigning around the state and has catchy parody videos out. I think The Devil Went Down to Georgia is one, and Way Down Yonder on the Chattahoochee is another, kind of skewering Brad Raffensperger and saying that, he's not a great leader and we need to do it. There's also a fourth candidate that very rarely gets talked about. That's former probate judge T.J. Hudson. And he is an election official, or was an election official, because his county probate judges run the election instead of an election board. So he's the only other one with election experience. But you've got really all of these candidates saying that Brad Raffensperger doesn't have the faith and trust of voters in Georgia, and ergo the system doesn't, and they're going to be the ones to fix it.
Okay, so when we are talking about these May primaries that are coming at May 24th, May 24th is our primary day. Thank you. Just to double check. Two of the House races that I think are going to be obviously huge to watch are going to be the 6th district and the 7th district. Those two congressional races, after redistricting, those have each become much more partisan, one more conservative and one more Democratic. Rahul, tell me a little bit about how you're seeing those two primaries shake out.
Well, starting with the 7th, and for those who kind of need to, who haven't been watching what happened, Lucy McBath's 6th congressional district was redrawn very Republican. It includes it kind of goes up into North Fulton and goes north, so much more Republican. She made the decision, and just a reminder to people, you do not have to live in your congressional district that you run for. You just don't have to. You have to do that if you're state house or state senate, but you don't have to do that for Congress. So she's decided to run for the 7th congressional, where that would be the incumbent of Carolyn Bordeaux. That's basically all of central and southern Gwinnett. Northern Gwinnett's kind of chopped up into different districts. And so it's Lucy McBath, a sitting congressman, versus Carolyn Bordeaux, a sitting congresswoman, and a state representative, Donna McLeod, who's also in that race. And her selling point is, I live in this district. So you've got 2 major candidates that you're lining up endorsements. I think it's at the moment, I mean, you'd have to ask Stephen, you give the edge to Lucy McBath, a bigger name, but Carolyn Bordeaux has represented a good chunk of that district for a while, and she does have strong endorsements. 6 congressional. So as I mentioned, the 6 got redrawn. It's a Republican seat, and you've got this wide range of Republicans who are jumping into that race. I don't have a strong feel yet. I've also not followed the 6th month. Again, as you mentioned, I'm kind of embedded at the Capitol. And so when we're done at the Capitol, I'm going to be hitting the campaign trail, probably run into Stephen a few times. It's going to be interesting to see what message works there in the 6th congressional. And the other race that I'm following is actually a district that I covered for 4 years, the 10th congressional. And that was that's the district that Jody Heiss used to represent. There have been some significant changes to that district, which include it removed the city of Milledgeville, Baldwin County, got taken out of it. If you look at a map, the district has been kind of reformed, but it's still Lake Oconee, Lake Sinclair areas, and then headed up towards Athens. I'm watching that race too, and that's also become even more interesting because you had Vernon Jones jump into that race. So, you've got Mike Collins in that race, who's the son of Matt Collins. He was the one in the runoff with Jody Heiss. So I'm watching that race. And to me, Vernon Jones in the 10th congressional is really one of the true tests of Donald Trump and the power of Donald Trump, because the only areas in that district that people really know Vernon Jones is going to be the Henry County part of the 10th congressional, the Newton County part of the 10th. And then when you go east, those are people who are going to be introduced to, this is Vernon Jones. He's endorsed by Donald Trump. And the effect of Donald Trump in Greene County, in Morgan County, in Bali, you cannot dismiss that at all, because what you've seen are new faces come into those counties, like Greene and Morgan County, who they're not Republicans, they're Trump supporters. That's what I'm watching in the 10th too. I'm really going to be interested to see how well Vernon Jones does, especially A, as a person who's not from that area, and B, and again, as I pointed out, you don't have to live in the district that you represent, but B, for example, somebody who voted against the heartbeat abortion bill while he was in the state legislature. How does he explain that? That's why I'm saying this is really about the power of Donald Trump in that 10th congressional race. That's something I'm watching there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the power of Donald Trump is really going to be the theme in so many of these statewide races, both in the primaries, and then for those Republicans who get through the primaries that are Trump endorsed, what does that look like in the general election? And I feel like it's one view in Atlanta, and it really feels different outside of the Atlanta metro area. So Chuck, talk a little bit about sort of how you see Donald Trump's appeal in those county Republican meetings that you go to, or how much is he still on people's minds, and how effective is he, do you think, for the Republican voters outside of Atlanta?
Well, Muskogee, solidly Democratic, not much. But, it's interesting. Somebody just
like your area.
Yeah. I'll get it. Harris County, okay, I'll give it
Thank
to you. But, he clearly has some sway. I mean, there are people who clearly listen to what the former president says. And somebody just threw a question here, and it was while Rahul was talking, was saying that they thought that Purdue was going to be a bigger test of Trump than Jones. And I kind of agree with that because I went to the Republican Women here in Columbus, and I think some of y'all have covered that event. And Senator Perdue spoke, I guess it was 11 days ago. And he was warmly received, very warmly received. About 75 to 100 women in the room, mostly women. There may be one of 5 guys in the whole place. It was mostly women. And he was really warmly received. But when he started in some of what I call Trump's greatest hits, he was even more warmly received. At one point, he was challenging the election results, and at one point, and it was blatantly wrong. It was not an accurate number, but he said, I think it was 232 or 235,000 voters moved in from outside of the state of Georgia, registered between the November general and the January 5th runoffs. That's not accurate. Only 103,000 or something, according to the Secretary of State's numbers, registered during that time, and not all of those were out of state. Clearly, some of those were people that had turned 18 in the middle and that kind of stuff. But that number, it was like, okay, it was bitten as if it were fact. And,
but then you talked to him afterward, didn't you?
And he stood by it. He said, "Well, they're all," because he said, "Where'd you get your information?" I said, I've reached out to Secretary of State's office since I interviewed him one-on-one at the studio, hour and a half after the event. And I had fact checked it in the middle of that. Or actually, I was fact checking it with the Secretary of State's office in real time because the number didn't sound right to me. And, and then I challenged him on it in the thing. He said, well, I got my numbers from the Secretary of State's office. But there's all sorts of numbers on the Secretary of State's website. It was that kind of answer to, and I don't want to characterize the whole interview by that one exchange, because I had a pretty good interview with Senator Perdue. And I learned some things, and, I think it's important when these major candidates get outside of Atlanta that people in the hinterlands in the other Georgia get a chance to talk to them the way y'all do up there, the reporters up there, because we've got our questions too. And Columbus is a weird place in a lot of ways, but one of the things that makes Columbus so vastly different is it's a Democratic county. Muskogee County is Democratic to the core. You look at the way it's voted, but it is an incredibly important stop the last 20 years for Republican candidates because of Aflac, Synovus, because of the W.C. Bradley Company, and all of the major business players that could easily be companies in Atlanta that support and back politicians and donate to campaigns. Republicans may not be coming down here for votes as much as they're coming down here to fill the coffers. So that makes Columbus kind of a strange dichotomy over maybe some of the other counties that are similarly situated but may not have the people that contribute to political campaigns like we do down here.
Rahul, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do want to jump in, and to both Laurel and to Chuck. I find Vernon Jones running in the 10th a little different because David Perdue is a known quantity state, right? He has a certain baseline, and yes, he's mainly running on his endorsement of Trump. He has talked about the state, eliminating the state income tax, which I've interviewed him about. That I have questions about that. But I just find that Vernon Jones, going into a district where he is basically starting from zero, that's why I find it, I think, a more compelling test of the former president. Again, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the Secretary of State's race, in the Lieutenant Governor's race. That's also going to be really interesting. That's Butch Miller versus Burt Jones. You've got two, pretty even candidates with those two, with Burt Jones having the endorsement of the former president. So each race, in my opinion, is different when it comes to the dynamic of the former president. but again, I just feel like the 10th is the one that intrigues me the most.
Stephen,
do you,
oh,
go ahead.
no, you go check.
Do you think, given the legal ramifications, the investigations in Fulton County, do you think we will see the former president in Georgia as much as we have seen him in Georgia in past election cycles?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine the president not coming. I mean, when you listen, if you listen to the full phone calls that that have been recorded and shared with the president, you can just tell it is deeply personal what happened here, him losing the state of Georgia. And I just, and I'm trying to think if I throw my opinion out here, but I think if you're Fani Willis, do you really serve the former president while he's in the state of Georgia? I don't know if you want to do that.
It'd make for an interesting rally.
It would be made for television. I do see the president, coming to the state. I mean, he already did that rally back in September. I fully expect to see the president rallying here in Georgia this year.
Yeah, he has said he's going to come before the primary, actually. So I think we can expect to see him. I want to bring Stephen, and also Stephen, from your reporting and from being on the ground, I know that what I see is that although the former president's personal brand is maybe debatable, the energy among activists is with his issues and his perspective of that populist, angry, fiery streak. That's what I'm seeing when I'm out. But Stephen, what are you seeing in terms of what's really going to be animating that primary field, do you think? And is it President Trump's endorsement, or is it something else?
I think it's less about the endorsement and more about the ideology and the approach to government and our existing laws and the way they've been enforced. In the 10th Congressional District, Mike Collins, I think I described him at his campaign kickoff as if Marjorie Taylor Greene actually understood government and if Donald Trump didn't tweet. There were people, Mike Collins has a lot of things that he wants to do as a congressman that you would expect Donald Trump to say and do, but there's a little bit more mechanisms to how that would actually work beyond sending mean tweets at 3 a.m. And I think what you're seeing, I don't want to say post-Trump because there's still a possibility. I mean, he looms over everything. But I think what you're seeing in Republican Party politics in Georgia, but in other places, is you're seeing a new crop of voters and activists and grassroots organizers and candidates that are putting more policy together from Trump's foray as president and kind of taking his proclamations and his general thoughts and stances on things and shoehorning them more into workable legislation and workable policy planks and workable things that you can talk to voters about, that kind of just makes sense. And so you're seeing kind of a new crop of kind of an electorate show up that are excited by his populist kind of messaging, that are skeptical of the government, skeptical of kind of the way some existing laws work and are put together, and are eager to do something about it far beyond just posting about it on social media.
Yeah, I think the other really marquee race in the state this year, where President Trump has already played a huge role, is in that U.S. Senate race with Herschel Walker, who the former president really essentially drafted and convinced to move from Texas to Georgia in order to mount a race for Senate. But it's still technically a crowded primary field, but it feels like Walker is really running away with that, so to speak. So Rahul, I don't know if you've had a chance to really dig into that Senate race too much, or if you have any perspective on that. And then I want to go to Chuck and see, Chuck, have any of those guys ended up in your neighborhood recently?
Most Republicans, I talk to, that's the race they feel like is done. They feel like when you talk to them and you talk to them on the ground. For example, I was talking to some of the lawmakers who were in Lumpkin County this past weekend when Herschel Walker was up there campaigning. Here's the reality. I want to share a conversation that I had with a county commissioner in rural Georgia. And I asked him, "Hey, what are you thinking on this race?" And he goes, "Look, I know Gary Black. Gary Black knows me. Gary Black has come to our county commission, our county party meetings. He came to our dairy festival. There's no way as a Republican county commissioner that I can endorse Gary Black because the reality is I would end up getting challenged by a Republican. By another Republican and possibly a Trump Republican. That's the challenge that I've heard, and that was really a kind of a perfect example of that. Again, it's a little different. That's why I consider the dynamic with Perdue and Kemp a little different. That Kemp already had everybody kind of, under the rooftop and just kind of everybody lined up, and you don't see people jumping as much. Herschel has a big following. And when you think about Republican voters leaning older, being older, they remember Herschel Walker. They know who Herschel Walker is. Younger voters may not, but if younger voters generally, and again, these are big, broad generalizations I make, because obviously there are a ton of older Democratic voters and a ton of younger Republican voters. They don't know who Herschel Walker is. So I think in that race, frankly, could Gary Black force a runoff? Possibly, because you've got other candidates, Latham Sattler and Kelvin King in that race. But that may be one of the races which is done on May 24th.
And I think you're probably right. When you look at sports celebrity races, we just had one last cycle in Alabama with Tommy Tuberville. Tommy in a U.S. Senate race as well, and Tuberville, former Auburn coach, and he got a lot of votes in Tuscaloosa too. He ran as conservative as you can run out of Opelika, Alabama, and he was elected, and defeated Jeff Sessions, which has its own Trumpian feel there. So you look at that, and I think celebrity will play a large part in this. I think in the primary, I think some of that sports celebrity will dissipate in the general because of what Senator Warnock has been doing over the last year and a half, and working across the aisle on some stuff. And I think some of that will clearly dissipate. And if you look in rural Georgia and you go out of here toward Cuthbert and other places, Senator Warnock is still coming in, even as a sitting U.S. senator, into the Buena Vistas and the Cuthberts and the places like that. He is making sure that the places that sent him there on January the 5th are still going to be there when he needs them on November the 8th of this year. And he's really working that hard. One caveat in that race for us is there is some Latham Sattler support in Columbus because he worked for Synovus.
Okay.
So yeah, he was, if you look, he was an administrative assistant to the president of Synovus in his latest disclosure. He worked for Synovus for a while. He's also got the Army military background that draws a certain amount of appeal down here with the Rangers and Fort Benning and all that. So Sadler has some foothold down this way. I don't know how that translates in other parts of the state, but I know that if you're looking at who's the number 2 in that race down in our part of the country, it could very well be Sadler.
Chuck, staying on that Senate race, it occurs to me we have not talked about Ukraine in this conversation yet. That the two conversations feel separate, but they're really not, because I don't think we know exactly what's going to happen in Ukraine. How do you think the dynamics there could affect that Senate race? It seems to me that if any race should be sort of, or could be influenced by dynamics in Ukraine, it might be a Senate race. How do you see that playing out, particularly because of Fort Benning being such a big piece of the community?
Because of the lens in which we have to look at things down here in the Chattahoochee Valley with Fort Benning, with the 75th Ranger Regiment based here, with most of the Army's basic training, captain's career courses, Ranger School, all that stuff is here. We look at things, our community has a very different view. And obviously our community, like the rest of the country, is paying very close attention to what's happening in the Ukraine right now. Senator Ossoff was here yesterday speaking at CSU and at Columbus State University. And the first thing he did was address the Ukrainian situation before he went into why he was here talking about robotics. But, you know, it was clear when you listen to Senator Ossoff, it had his attention. And I think that I got to be careful how I say this. I want to say it right. In 2016, I interviewed General Wesley, who was the two-star general commander of Fort Benning. This was October of 2016. They were getting ready to do the Maneuver Warfighter Conference. And the subject was the Russian threat. October 2016, I get the time frame right. And so I go in there, and then all of a sudden, Fort Benning has allowed us to cover it 3-4 years coming in. They shut it off the week before. We're not going to allow media coverage this time. And myself, Army Times, a few other publications pitched a fit. I was at the newspaper back then. So they gave us a one-on-one with General Eric Wesley, who left here and went to the Futures Command. And he was talking about Russia. And this was right before President Trump got elected. And he said the gravest threat to the United States of America is Russia. It is the number one threat. There's no other threat that even comes close to it. And I'm paraphrasing what he said, but that has, through the whole Trump presidency, the Russian stuff that came out there, the Clinton Russian stuff, everything, you know, General Wesley's words have been ringing in my ears for 5 years now. And that ringing got louder this week as the invasion. And that's why I think people in this part of the state, when we're attached to a military installation like our community is paying incredible attention to this right now, because people in the United States Army know what the threat that Putin and Russia pose. They have been dealing, particularly the guys that are Rangers, Special Forces, the guys that kick in the doors and do a lot of the secret squirrel stuff. And, you know, you talk to those guys, they know what this threat is. And that's why they're paying incredibly close attention right now to this. And I think that's why when you hear some Republicans defending Putin or defending Russia, it echoes to me like, whoa, wait a minute, that's not what I heard, you know, General Wesley say 5 years ago, and it's only gotten worse. But anyway, I digress. But that's does that make any sense at all?
It does. I think it really speaks to the fact that this is a really dangerous time for the country. And as we're choosing our leaders, I actually wrote a column about this for Sunday's paper. This kind of a crisis really reveals the leadership of our current leaders. And I think it also tests the response and the demeanor of our people and candidates who say they want to be our leaders. And when we see their comments and we see what they're saying about Russia, what they're saying about what the United States should be doing, it's a good chance to envision exactly what would be happening if they actually won the races they're trying to do. And I think that especially for that Senate race, for Herschel Walker, he came out and was very critical of President Biden, but did not criticize President Putin. And I think that's the type of senator he might be. It would could mirror very much President Trump's comments, although Herschel Walker certainly didn't compliment President Putin as former President Trump did. Well, one question that I had coming into this conference that I wanted to run past all three of y'all, because I know it is looming over my own work, but as we're going into 2022, the question that was posed to me is, what about the 2020 race has influenced the way I'm approaching 2022? And so I, for one thing, I'm trying to pace myself a little bit because I did not know that 2020 was going to keep going on and on and on. But I also feel for myself a really intense need to fact check, add context, challenge candidates when they are speaking. After the 2020 elections, I think there were so many facts that were not accurate. I think some candidates were not telling the truth. It was so disorienting to see people just flat out lying in some cases that reporters had to really get our feet underneath us and think, how do I report this without seeming like I am biased or seeming like we are not taking this at face value, just sort of layering in facts and details and context. And so that's been my, I think I take everything more, not skeptically. I think I'm more skeptical, but I'm still not cynical, which is, I guess, the right way to be for a reporter. But Stephen, I think you spent more time than anybody I know dealing with the election aftermath. And so tell me if that has influenced, I know you're, first of all, covering these county election offices, but how has 2020 influenced what you're doing for 2022 in your process?
I mean, well, 2020 never ended. I guess that's
exactly
the first thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, to slightly keep it topical for the audience, I mean, I dealt more with the legal system and laws and rules and court cases and judges and things than I had thought would be necessary for an election. I realized in 2020 that there are a lot of people that have no idea what they're talking about, that claim they do. And I didn't want to be one of them. There were a lot of lawsuits that never should have been filed by people that didn't have expertise in what they were filing in, miscited law, misinterpreted rules, procedures, and things like that. And but because they were filed and because things were written and because somebody put the word affidavit over the top of it, there were a lot of people that believed that was the unassailable truth, and it was their unassailable truth. And so in approaching this year and a lot of things, I mean, I'm a big explainer person. I like explaining how things work, why things don't work, providing primary source documents for people to read and things. And so especially with this massive new election law changing how everything is done, from absentee voting to how the votes are counted, my approach to elections this year is to be a lot more proactive in explaining how things are working or not working, and the underlying rules and laws and procedures and things, because there was a lot of time where the water was being muddied by people that should have known better. And it was hard to push back on those things because, I went to a nice journalism law school program out at Loyola in Los Angeles, but I am not a lawyer. And I can't file a motion saying, Your Honor, this is full of untruths. So, I have to rely on different things to try to show the audience what's fact and fiction, and then help them draw the conclusions from there. But also, I spend a lot of time now outside of Metro Atlanta, because I think the Atlanta focused view on politics in Georgia misses a lot of things on both sides of the aisle. And I've also spent a lot of the last 2 years covering the mechanisms of the Republican Party in Georgia. I don't think outlets, national or local, really do a good job of covering the mechanisms of Republicans. They cover Republicans who happen to be in power, but it's a little bit different from, the local county GOP meetings or the state GOP convention or the policy planks that go behind the different candidates doing that. And so, if you were to ask the average person, they would probably tell you that they think that journalism and media outlets skew more left and skew more liberal and favor Democrats and things. I don't necessarily think that's the case in Georgia and with a lot of the reporting across the state, but people have the perception. So also just working a lot harder to make sure that no matter who's being interviewed or who reads and consumes the story, they see that I and we as journalists in Georgia are the ones that have to live with the consequences of our stories and are doing what's truthful and factual and contextual, because this is our home too.
That's right. Yes, I told people I have always covered national politics, and the AJC was my first job covering regional and local politics. And I'd never swum in the same fishbowl as all the other fish. I used to just visit the tank and then go home, to a different tank. So it really, to me, feels like it increases accountability. And I think that's the most important part about local journalism. Moving over to you, Rahul, how did 2020 and how you covered that, how has that influenced how you're approaching 2022?
Two things. I came from a different style of journalism. And I do need to point out, I was not trained as a journalist. I'm an economist by training. Which is, here's what X said, here's what Y said, and I just laid out, the audio on the radio. And that's literally the kind of journalism that I have enjoyed doing for a long time. Put the question out there and let the person answer it. I have had to shift and do adding more context and more history to stories, because it's one thing for someone to put a political bend on an answer. It's a whole nother thing when the answer is just flatly bent. So I have seen myself have to add more context to stories, more while this does this, it hasn't actually happened, or this, person made this claim, this happened. So adding context and taking a little more time to explain things. Here's the other thing, and this is something that I have actively been doing. We in the media, and I hate to use we in the media because that's always, a loaded term. I am trying to take an active role in media literacy. Going to speak to the Morgan County Rotary Club, talking to a group of students wandering through the Capitol, talking to a youth group that comes to the Capitol. They ask the most basic questions about how we do our jobs. And I, if I see a group, I'll be like, hey, you got a question about how we do our jobs? And it's always the most basic questions. And how, who tells you what stories to do, or how many people are involved in a story, and people will bring up specific stories. Why did this happen, or why did that happen? And for those in the audience, if you'd like me to come to speak to your group, I will come speak to your group, because I like talking about the process and who the editors are and where my story ideas come from. A lot of people are surprised that the vast majority of my story ideas come from me. So more context in my journalism, and trying to actively, if I see a group at the state capitol, say, hey, can I answer any questions about how I do my job? And doing more media literacy. I feel like that 2020 has made me realize that I need to go out there and say, hey, I'll answer questions about how I do my job.
Okay, and we're getting some questions online from the audience, but before I go to those, Chuck, did covering 2020 for you change anything about your process heading into the next election as you're covering it?
It did in a couple of ways. One, I had quit drinking several years prior to 2020, and I was able to stay off of it. So it showed me that I was doing pretty good. But
Congrats.
I say that only half jokingly. But one of the things Rose said just struck a nerve. I mean, it's not a nerve, struck a chord with me, is the media literacy is incredibly important. And I was at a Republican event, and they were bashing the media, bashing everybody. And I went up to one of the organizers, and I just said, hey, man, what is that all about? He looks at me, he goes, Chuck, we're talking about the media. We're not talking about you. And I'm like, what the heck do you think I do? But I mean, it's like when they live with you, they see you and they have to deal with you and they know you got their cell phone number. All of a sudden, you know, they may go to church with you or whatever. The closer you get away from the national talking heads to you know, then Atlanta's another level. Then you get down into Columbus's where you literally are in their way and your paths cross all the time. It's incredibly important to make sure that they see me as media, but they also see me as somebody who lives in the community, raised kids in the community, has grandkids in the community. I care about the community. And most journalists care about their community, but they may not see that as much with you, Patricia, because they don't really know what your community is because you're statewide in focus, you know, but I'm not. I'm just a little guy back down here in a pumpkin patch in Columbus, Georgia. And I mean, you know, so to me, what has changed is the way I'm explaining more on my social media platforms about the process and how the sausage is made. You know, I mean, I'm going into how I got an interview with Senator Perdue or how I'm getting an interview with Governor Kemp in the near future. I will tell people what I'm doing and how I'm doing it because they need to know that. Well, you know, why aren't you interviewing Stacey Abrams? Well, right now, Stacey Abrams is not the story, but I will be asking Stacey Abrams for interviews just like I am Kemp and Perdue. And I think that's what you do right now is you oversimplify stuff to the people that are in your circles that are reading and watching and depending on you to get it right. And like with the Perdue speech to the Republican women the other day, when you hear something that you suspect to be blatantly wrong, you have a moral and a journalistic responsibility to challenge it. I don't know if I quite felt as strongly as that in 2018 or 2019, but now if you hear something that you know is inaccurate, factually inaccurate, I kind of call it the Brad Raffensperger rule. If you see it and you know it's not right, it's incorrect information, raise the question. I mean, that's all. I mean, essentially, that's all he did for a year is he debunked falsehoods.
Yeah, it's the if you see something, say something rule, but just applied to media. And I think that the media literacy part is so important because it is a new talking point to call journalists fake news and to discount the media coverage of a campaign if it's something that's not favorable. And I have had the experience where I have spoken with a candidate the night before about a story. And then the next day they would tweet something out about fake news. They're like, why I have to give this story on my own because I can't trust the fake news. I'm like, literally, you called me yesterday to tell me all about your story, which I am writing and it will be accurate and it won't be fake news. But so I think the attacks on the media do make it all the more important to be transparent about how the stories are told.
And as somebody who has transitioned from newspapers to on air, our former station manager who's left and gone to Savannah, folks would call in when they would say, my first 6 months on the air was terrible. I did not know how to do it, and I was terrible. And he finally said, well, I guarantee you, one caller was calling in and saying, why do you keep putting it back on the air? And he said, well, I guarantee you it's not fake news. And so that has been my rallying cry. You can tell I'm not fake news.
That's terrific. Okay, one of the questions that we have gotten in on the chat is, how do you cover a candidate who will not debate his opponents or talk to the media? I think that's a good question because we have had in the past candidates who did not do all the debates that they were requested. I think David Perdue most famously declined to debate John Ossoff in the runoff campaign against him, although they did debate in the general election. So Stephen, I'll take that over to you. What do you do with a candidate if you find that you don't have access to them directly, but you do need to cover their campaign?
So Herschel Walker's campaign would not do interviews. Still haven't had an interview with Herschel Walker, but he did a lot of interviews with a lot of other places. So I did a big story putting together all the audio of every interview he did do with everyone except me. And, it's still his own words. Counted up the number of interviews that he had done with the different things like that. But, other than that, I haven't had an issue with somebody not wanting to talk and not do things. I think it's a much different environment. I mean, all eyes are on Georgia. And if you decline to talk to a local media outlet, I mean, I think there was an issue. I can't remember the exact details, but there was an issue where I think it was in Macon. There was an event in Macon where a TV station was promised by a campaign to come and cover this event, but like the local organizer said, no, you can't be there. And the campaign was like, no, you're not doing that. Like, we are letting the local media in. So I think it's a lot different now. But I mean, as far as debates, we'll see. There's the Atlanta Press Club debates. There's other debates. We'll see what happens. But I think hopefully nowadays candidates see that not showing up to a debate with your opponent is probably a lot more damaging than whatever gotcha question the candidate will spring on them, or whatever viral social media clip that happens. And so hopefully that's not a thing. But, luckily also with the internet and social media, people do interviews. They just don't do interviews with us.
Stephen,
Yes.
when Senator Perdue did not do the debate with Ossoff, that news broke while Ossoff was in Columbus. We had just interviewed the senator, went to a rally, and it broke between the time we did a one-on-one interview and the rally. And just in my playing back of that whole runoff deal, I think that's the day David Perdue lost the Senate race. And looking back at the way the Ossoff, I got to hear Senator Ossoff's initial reaction to him not debating. We got stuff, when it was still fresh, before they really had a chance to formulate how they were going to go at it, and then started seeing the social they started pushing out on that. I really think that's the day David Perdue crossed the Rubicon.
Okay, let's see. I have another question from the audience. Let's see. What is the most important thing to watch in 2022 that could affect 2024? I think that is a question about, could the midterm elections affect the presidential elections? Stephen, do you have a thought on that? I see you're nodding your head.
I think the biggest thing, honestly, is going to be at the state level. If Democrats can win a number of statewide offices, like you mentioned earlier, Patricia, how a sort of divided government is going to work, because Democrats can't flip the state legislature. The appointments and things that Governor Brian Kemp has made could not be easily overturned and undone by Stacey Abrams. So you still have a lot of conservative boards and things. But if you have Democrats in leadership positions, how is a divided government going to work? In Washington, it works terribly. At the state level, you can't just throw up your hands and obfuscate things because, it's going to shut down. But that's something to watch. But then also, we've talked about Trump a lot. If Donald Trump's primary candidates either A, don't win the primary, or B, don't win the general, I think Georgia could also be part of a growing body of evidence that you could see another Republican or two have an opening to potentially be the presidential nominee and run for president in 2024. And Georgia could and will still be an important 2024 presidential election state.
Okay, great. Another question that we've gotten from the audience. There's been so much controversy about education over the last year, and definitely down at the state legislature. Do you think education issues are going to be important in the 2022 elections? Rahul, because you have been covering all of those issues, what do you think? How do you think that kind of substantive issue, how is that going to play in 22?
I think that's what Republicans are hoping for. I think with the legislation that you're seeing, parental bill of rights, divisive concepts, CRT, as I mentioned earlier, the transgender girls playing in girls' sports. I think all of those, they're looking at what happened in Virginia. And, a lot of when I look at what's happening both here in Atlanta, But you know what? We talk about getting outside of Atlanta. I'm from Augusta. And so I'm always trying to see what's happening there. And I used to cover the 10th Congressional District and try to see what's happened there. What I'm seeing with that education, with those education bills is getting out your voters. This is what we did. This is what's getting our voters out. And one of my coworkers at WABE got a really interesting quote from a Republican state senator, and I'm doing off the quote off the top of my head, but it was along the lines of, if we make the 2022 elections in Georgia about the 2020 elections, we're going to lose. If we make it about education, we're going to win.
Wow.
And so it's a story I think he's still working on, but it's going to be interesting when that story does come out. And it's you've got a group in the Republican Party who are saying we've got to run on issues, and that's what's going to get our voters out, not elections. So all of those are going to be interesting. And Democrats do have a role in this, in that saying what you're doing is hurting the system, hurting principals, hurting teachers and students. That's the argument that they're going to bring to the table on those education bills.
Okay, great. Well, Rahul, Bali, Stephen Fowler, Chuck Williams, I want to thank all three of you for being such knowledgeable, fascinating panelists. I know that we could go all day, but I have been instructed to please wrap it up before 5 o'clock. Richard, I will toss it back to you if that's okay. And thank you so much for having us, and thanks for including all four of us in this panel this afternoon.
Absolutely terrific panel this afternoon. Thank you so very much to you, to Stephen, Rahul, Chuck, and Sean for helping organize it. Terrific job. That brings us to the end of our conference. I think it's been a fun and very educational 3 days, whether you agree or not. We ask that when you get the email asking your opinion, you fill it out and send it back. We can only get better if we hear from you with your honest appraisals, what worked and what didn't. If you're interested in helping put on this conference next year, we're always looking for smart volunteers with good ideas and the willingness to chase down panelists. If you look over my shoulder, you'll see the email info@gfaf.org. If you are interested, send us an email. We'll connect you with the organizing committee. I really want to give a really big shout out to the organizing committee. Many hours putting this together, and thanks to all of you, in particular our fearless leader, Peter Canfield. We look forward, hopefully, to seeing you in person next year. Until then, thank you for attending and have a great weekend.